Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. This is our March 31st, 2022 legislative update. And much to my surprise, we have yet another budget. You may recall that in our last update, I expressed a certain amount of amazement that Congress actually finished the FY 2022 budget. Passed an omnibus. I didn't think they were going to have time, but they did, and credit to them. At the time, I told you that the president was planning on releasing what is called a skinny budget, kind of just a high-level budget summary, sometime in April. And again, to our surprise, he not only released his budget early, he released it on Monday, but it's more substantive than we had expected. And so the fiscal 2023 budget race is on. But before we get to that, three big engineering events happened on March 31st. INEVAC, the first commercially available computer. The first one was sold to the U.S. Census Bureau in 1951. Today is the anniversary of the opening of the Eiffel Tower. A little shout out to our civil engineering friends. And today is also the anniversary of Wabash, Indiana, becoming the first town in the world completely lit by electric lights. So way to go, Mr. Edison. So it was a surprisingly big day in engineering. So back to the president's budget. Excuse me. It is not a complete budget. But it's also not a skinny budget. It's somewhere in between. What's interesting about what the president did is typically these budget documents, you start with 5 to 10 pages of the president telling us all how wonderful his budget is. We're going to invest in this, we're going to invest in that, we're going to do great things. All the problems in the world will be solved because of my budget. And typically that's the part that everybody reads and everybody ignores the rest of the budget. And you just pulled some highlights out of that. IEEE-USA generally doesn't do that because they usually don't highlight all of our budgets. But oddly enough, President Biden didn't really do that this year. His budget started off with the talk of what his administration has already accomplished. But then it goes into some really, really dense budget documents, looking again mostly at high-level numbers. He doesn't get into all the program details. But it's really an accountant's budget. And so it has a lot more detail than I expected and a lot more information than is normal for the first version of a president's budget to come out. Some of the highlights, a lot of money for cybersecurity. I can't tell you exactly how much because it's splattered all over the budget, but it's definitely a priority of the president's and of Congress's. The president has proposed promoting domestic manufacturing, adding $200 million to NIST's budget to open 2 new manufacturing institutes. This is part of the Manufacturing USA program. Manufacturing institutes are government-owned facilities that private companies can use to help them manufacture. So they have some really high-end equipment that companies can use to manufacture other equipment. They have experts in the manufacturing process that smaller companies can tap to help them get going. They're generally pretty cool institutes, and opening 2 more in parts of the country that don't have them should promote manufacturing across the country, which is a good thing. And since a lot of those are high tech, that should be a lot of IEEE jobs in there as well. The president's budget includes a 9.5% increase in DoD research. That is important to note for 2 reasons. One, the president actually proposed cutting DoD research in last year's budget, and so did the House, although ultimately we got a decent increase in the budget. The fact that he's proposing a 9.5% increase this year is a good sign. Now, 9.5% is usually a good number for a budget increase, except when inflation is running in the 6% to 7% range, in which case that is a modest real increase. And this is one of the issues that is going to be really driving the budget debate this year. Everybody wants to get the deficit under control. Everybody knows that getting the deficit under control helps with inflation. But if you just increase budgets 5%, that represents a real decrease in spending power because inflation is running more than 5%. Some groups have started asking Congress for increases to their budget in the 18 to 20% range, which seems wildly optimistic to me. But it's going to be a problem because any increase that's less than 10% is going to be at best a very modest actual increase. It's one of the damaging things caused by inflation. The president has proposed increasing investments in the space industry, Not exactly clear what that means, but it certainly at least partially means investing in commercial spaceflight and promoting commercial spaceflight, which is good because, as we've noted on these updates before, prioritize or allowing and empowering private space companies to operate has been the policy of the Biden administration, the Trump administration, the Obama administration, the Bush administration, and the Clinton administration. The policy on that has been reasonably consistent for quite a long time now, a rare instance of bipartisan support in an increasingly partisan Washington. So it's good to see the president is maintaining that commitment. Lots of money, lots of programs for renewable and clean energy, which is not too surprising. The president also is proposing the creation of a new grid deployment office within the Department of Energy. That would focus on grid resilience efforts, which is good and very important. President only puts $90 million into the department, which is not a huge amount of money, but creating an institutional tool that we can use to fund and promote grid resilience is a good thing. All of which is nice and lovely, but probably doesn't matter. As you know, the Congress does not have to pay attention or even acknowledge the president's budget request, and generally doesn't. At least the last 10 years, and probably longer than that, Congress has generally not paid too much attention to what the president wants. The significance of the president's budget is that it does launch the formal budget process on Capitol Hill. Not technically, but effectively it does. And appropriators on Capitol Hill will use some of the president's budget numbers to start the conversation, which could then go in any number of directions that have nothing to do with what the president wants. But the fact that the budget has been released and the fact that it is so detailed should help Congress get going on their efforts to pass an FY 2023 budget. Excuse me. Now, I mentioned appropriators a minute ago. The AAAS, and specifically Matt Horahan, who is one of the country's leading experts on the federal R&D budget, has produced a very interesting little report looking at the Competes Acts. There have been multiple Competes Acts. One passed in 2007, one passed in 2010, and we are now debating a new one in Congress today, which we'll get to in a minute. But the 2007 and 2010 bills both called for fairly significant investments in basic research and authorized federal research agencies to spend significant amounts of money. So Matt Horahan said, okay, Congress said they wanted to spend this money. How much did we actually spend? And we got the blue line on the chart, which is basically what federal R&D spending would have been if there had been no Competes Acts. Little bump up around 2010, 2011, but not much. This very nicely illustrates the difference between an authorization bill and an appropriation bill. As you know, authorization is Congress saying agencies are allowed to spend this much. Appropriations bills actually make the money available to spend, and the two don't have anything to do with each other in many cases. What we can see here is that Congress passed authorization bills allowing the government to spend lots and lots of money on R&D, and then the appropriators simply didn't put it in the budget. This is why IEEE-USA doesn't pay a tremendous amount of attention to authorization bills. I mean, they're important, you need them, and they allow for useful discussions, but it's the appropriations bills that really require the most attention. Speaking of federal R&D budgets, there's interesting development in the Competes-USICA discussion. If you were paying very close attention, you will have noticed that the Senate has passed the Competes Act. Competes has passed the House, Competes has passed the Senate, so we're in good shape, right? Not really. What happened is, under the Constitution, all bills that raise revenue have to start in the House. USICA technically raises some revenue. It's not really a big revenue generator, but it does raise some money in a few places, which means arguably it had to start in the House, but it didn't. It started in the Senate. So what the Senate has done is they took the Competes Act, introduced it in the Senate, deleted all of its text, and amended it to become USICA. and then they passed that. So what the Senate really did is it repassed USICA in a form that solves the constitutional question, but also makes it easier procedurally to conference. And so the House and Senate are now moving rather aggressively towards conferencing the two bills rather. That is coming up with a unified bill that they both can vote on. We expect conferees to be named shortly. Rumor has it would be today, but I haven't seen anything. But certainly by next week. Negotiations, again, some people on Capitol Hill are saying negotiations will be solved next week, be finished next week. That seems rather optimistic. And then we run into an Easter break. So I don't actually expect the negotiations to finish until towards the end of the month at best. But once they do, the path to passage is actually fairly clear. If appropriators can come up with a reasonably, even slightly bipartisan bill, and they should be able to do that as long as they don't add any poison pills to the bill, it should pass both the House and the Senate, maybe not easily, but it should pass them. And then whatever they pass, President Biden will sign into law, which means USICA has a reasonably, competes has a reasonably good chance of becoming the most significant change to U.S. R&D policy of the last decade. Now, a lot of this bill is, in fact, authorization money, and then we got to go to the appropriators to go get the cash. But there are a lot of legal changes, a lot of policy changes, a lot of regulatory changes in there as well, which could be at least as consequential as the budget numbers themselves. We've talked about one of the bigger ones, I think, which is the creation of a new tech directorate at the NSF. Now, that has already happened. It was in the omnibus bill. There is a new technology, innovation, and partnerships. That's the P. Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate within the NSF, which should focus on more speculative, high-impact research, much of which will be engineering and technology. We're hoping the final version of Competes better defines what that directorate is and funds it, but merely the creation of that directorate will help us secure budgets for technology research moving forward, which is why we're so excited about it. Mentioned this last time, but IEEE-USA had an op-ed published in The Hill, written by our Vice President of Government Relations, Becky Taylor, talking about why we love USICA and why we think Congress should pass it. Little note, the FY 2022 National Defense Strategy was released this week. For IEEE members that are in the defense community, especially those at the Department of Defense, this matters enormously to you. IEEE-USA doesn't get into defense policy that much, but I did want to note it and note that this report will have an impact on Defense Department R&D strategy, and Capitol Hill does pay attention to this particular report. So it will likely inform some of the budget decisions, some of the appropriations decisions that we see later on this year. So its existence is important. And if you're curious, there's a link there at the bottom of your screen, but it's probably much easier just to Google FY 2022 National Defense Strategy. Little note on Senator Klobuchar's antitrust legislation that we've talked about before. This is the attempt to use antitrust law to break up some of the tech monopolies online. That bill, not surprisingly, has gotten rather severe pushback from big tech. They are spending big dollars to defeat the bill. Their emphasis is on claims that the bill would harm privacy, that it would put personal information online in jeopardy. IEEE-USA has been approached by both sides of the debate to weigh in on that question and weigh in on the bill in general. Now, we don't have a position on antitrust law, and we don't intend to take one anytime soon, but we do have positions on online privacy, which we think is very important. Our volunteers, IEEE members themselves, have taken a look at Senator Klobuchar's bill, and we do not believe that it will have much of an impact on online privacy at all. And we intend to tell Senator Klobuchar that in a letter. Again, we're not weighing in on the bill itself, but we are weighing in on that question, and we're using that question to remind Senator Klobuchar and the rest of Congress that the country does need a digital privacy law to protect individuals' data online. A bunch of stuff happening at the Federal Communication Commission. I have been accused, possibly correctly, by some members of ignoring the FCC over the last couple of months. So I wanted to highlight some of the things going on there because there are some exciting things happening. The FCC has announced a proposal to provide 100% high-speed broadband across the entire country by 2026. Now, this is going to require some money, so they need Congress's help to do it. But they have a plan, and the plan itself doesn't actually appear to be online yet, but it should be up shortly. And that's a good thing. IEEE-USA has been asking this for a long time, and so we look forward to looking at that report in detail to see how we can help make it happen. There will be a second meeting on the broadband labels issue, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. This is making sure that broadband companies properly document how fast, how reliable, how expensive their broadband services will be. That meeting to discuss broadband labels will be April 7th. It should be broadcast online if you're curious. Senate Democrats think they have a plan for approving President Biden's commissioners for the FCC and FTC. There is an additional commissioner seat vacant at both of those commissions, which unfortunately make both the commissions aren't operating correctly because they're deadlocked between Republicans and Democrats. This additional seat on the FCC in particular should break that deadlock. The problem here is that the Democrats have enough votes on the floor of the Senate to approve any Biden appointee, even if every Republican votes against it, because the vice president breaks a tie. But the vice president can't break a tie in committee because she doesn't serve on the committees. And so the Republicans can block a nominee simply by voting entirely against each one of them. And they've been doing that in some cases. There is a procedural move the Democrats can take to go around the committee. And leaders in the Senate have announced that they intend to do that for both commissioners of the FCC and FTC sometime soon. And that's the word everybody is using. I don't know if that means this afternoon or next month, but I suspect it'll be early April when they try that maneuver. Now, the trick with that is that they need every Democrat to support that decision for it to work, because if one Democrat votes no, the nominee gets defeated on the floor of the Senate anyway. But it looks like the nominees in both cases have at least complete Democratic support and might pick up one or two Republicans on the floor, which will allow them to be approved. There was a hearing this morning in the House Energy and Commerce Committee on broadband deployment. That actually was the 4 members of the FCC who have been confirmed, talking about what the FCC is doing on broadband deployment and talking about their report. A recording of that event should be available online at the House Energy and Commerce Committee website. We did have some interesting news, some good news this week. Cybersecurity legislation actually passed and should be signed into law by President Biden shortly. The Better Cybercrime Metrics Act, which is not a good name because we actually don't want better cybercrime, but whatever, is designed to help local law enforcement agencies better detect, prevent, and prosecute cyber criminals. It does that predominantly by standardizing reporting requirements. The problem is some of the basic terminology used to discuss cyber attacks and kind of quantify them hadn't been standardized. And so different agencies, different jurisdictions were reporting cybercrime differently, which made it very difficult to detect trends and do research and basically understand what was going on out there. So this bill will standardize it, which is a small thing, but a vitally important thing. It will also require companies in the critical infrastructure space to report serious cyber attacks and any ransomware payments to the government within 72 hours, which should again help law enforcement agencies, particularly federal law enforcement agencies, get a handle on what's actually happening out there, which is a first step towards doing something about it. The final vote on this bill was 377 to 48, which is about as bipartisan as you can get. Again, just demonstrating that a lot of these tech issues are not nearly as partisan as the noise coming out of Washington and Congress would suggest. Some very good news with our Congressional Visits Day. Thank you, Jonathan. it is scheduled for next Tuesday and mostly Wednesday. We currently have 300 participants to this year's CVD. That is notably up from the 189 we had last year. We are scheduled to meet with 47% of Congress, which is awesome. And that includes 80% of the Senate, although that number is no longer correct because there are 100 senators. Calculating percentage is pretty easy. And we just heard actually this morning that one Senate office has told us they do not do constituent meetings. 26 years in Washington, I have never heard of any legislative office simply saying no on principle to meetings with their voters. I'm not going to tell you which office it is because I don't want to cause controversy or anything. And I suspect they will reverse this decision soon. But it was an interesting, never heard of anybody doing that before. So one of our Senate meetings is not going to happen. We do expect to get the rest of them. We'll be focusing on the USICA competes situation, which we just discussed, the FY 2023 budget, kind of at a very high level, talking about what we think the priorities should be. We're going to mention SBIRs, small business research loans, which need to be reauthorized this year, and the DoD R&D budget. Because it was almost cut last year, we want to make sure Congress knows we support it this year. Registration is formally closed on Congressional Visits Day. We can probably squeeze one or two additional people in if anybody's interested. Just send me an email and we'll see what we can do. Our next update will be Thursday, April 14th, Tax Day Eve. Very big day here in Washington. We will be coming out of the Easter recess at that point. The period between Easter and the 4th of July is kind of hardcore non-budgetary legislation season. If you want to pass a law this year, other than the budget, you don't have to get it done between now and the 4th of July, but you have to get it close. It has to be basically finished in order to get it done. Because once you hit the 4th of July, you start doing some budget work. There's not a lot of days in July anyway because of the 4th of July recess. Then the August recess comes, September hits, that's budget crunch time, and then we're into election season. And so if you don't have it close by the 4th of July, you're in real tough shape other than the budget itself. A few other exceptions. So by the 14th, we should see what Congress intends to spend its time on this year. And we should start to get a sense for what the FY 2023 budget is going to look like in kind of very big terms. So we'll have plenty to talk about. And with that, if you have any questions, as my capable colleague Jonathan Cho has said in the comment, the little scroll at the bottom of your screen, if you have questions and comments, please put them in the chat, the comment box on your screen. And while you're doing that, I will remind you that my phone number is 202-530-8326. My email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. Feel free to reach out anytime if I or IEEE can be of service. And with that, I'm going to open up the comments, see what we have here. Yeah, interesting things going on in trade policy. I've seen this comments from a couple different places. Thank you, Will. It's good to hear from you. I'm a former Vice President of Government Relations here at IEEE-USA. U.S. trade policy is shifting clearly. 20 years ago, it was all about openness, removing tariffs, removing trade barriers, and those kind of WTO-level trade disputes. It is quite clear that Washington, D.C. and Congress are not as excited or focused on those sort of agreements as they used to be. A lot of that has to do with China, which is seen by a lot of people in Washington as not a reasonable trade partner. And some of it is just simply economic. We want to boost our own chip manufacturing through the CHIPS Act, which is in USICA and competes and is in very good shape. But what's happening, Will, with the debate is a lot of it's just sort of happening. There's not a lot of discussion about trade policy. The U.S. trade representative is not really visible around D.C. these days. Part of this is also COVID. When you shut down the whole economy, these issues aren't really quite as pressing. But we are seeing a shift, and we're going to keep an eye on it. when I came to Washington, this was the big hot issue, was whether China should join the WTO or not. And so trade debates were a big part of the discussion around here. And it's notable that they really aren't anymore. I'm not sure if that's going to continue, but it should continue for at least a little while. Requiring the FCC to require companies to publish the non-compete terms. That's interesting. So Kevin, one of our volunteers, winner of our public service award for his work up in Massachusetts on non-compete agreements. As you know, Kevin, Congress has been reluctant to weigh in on this issue because non-compete agreements are employment law, and that's a state issue, not a federal issue. However, you've identified an interesting little niche, which might be of more interest to policymakers. The government is looking at ways to force companies to be more transparent, not in this space, but in environmental context and some other contexts. For example, I was looking at a proposal this morning to require companies and, most importantly, local jurisdictions to reveal any aid given to companies to get them to open up in the jurisdiction. So if, Muncie, Indiana decides to give, John Deere $1 million to open a plant in Muncie, they would have to make the terms of that agreement public. And so this is similar to that. We might have an opening. It might be something they're willing to consider. It's a good point, Kevin, that these are not technically confidential, but that doesn't mean the FTC is going to want to require it, and it doesn't mean that the companies aren't going to fight it if we try. But still a good point. Tim, yeah, that was kind of my response too. Like, really? Huh, you sure about that? I suspect they'll be rethinking that very quickly. I think the senator involved is not a safe senator either. He's from a swing state. Okay, but he's a rookie, so, he'll learn. They all learn eventually. I'm not seeing any other questions. So I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. As always, if you think of things 10 minutes or 10 days from now, feel free to reach out. And otherwise, thank you for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you on the 14th. Have a lovely spring.
My superpower is engineering. I've been a roboticist almost all my life now. I think engineering is just as creative as the arts. Engineers, we solve problems. It impacts the world. It makes a difference. Without IEEE, I don't think I would have the network that I have. Anyone can get involved with IEEE-USA at any time. There's an immense amount of value for anyone at any career stage.